Hello, today is May 3rd, 2019. This is the Testing Comments office hours. Um, let's take a look at the agenda for today. Let me share my screen. Hopefully folks can see my screen here. Let's take a look. We don't even have a date in there. We're doing awesome. All right, so let's add the details here. While I'm doing Administrivia, are there topics that folks wanted to discuss today? Or should we just kind of like walk through the obvious stuff that we've been working on?
Yeah, I mean, to me, we can just talk about the stuff that we've been working on or reviewing. I think there were a couple action items from the 19th.
Import restrictions. We'll create or work on the test image deduping work investigation process. Do you have an update with that one?
No, so the image deduping, I think the same update I gave last time, I haven't worked on in the past week, was I still think the right approach for that is that it's going to be effectively impossible to take all of the E2E images and dedupe them in any meaningful way because there are such large and specialized images, especially around the vector and GPU stuff. So I still think the right approach is to try and break down the list at least so that in that centralized location, you can say like, look, the conformance tests only require 2 or 3 images. But then the other tests, if you're doing specialized storage stuff or GPU stuff, like here is this other list that you may need to use. At the minimum, we should pull out the conformance ones and do those. So that's my plan, but I haven't gotten anywhere on that.
Do you have the issue number?
I do not, but I'll link to it. I'll look it up while we're doing the rest of the meeting.
Yeah, I think the one thing that would be useful is to, even if we don't make tangible progress, is to write an update in the issue just for community's sake if there's other people that want to come along and help with the process. Because I do know that the Microsofties, Microsofters, I like calling them softies. The Microsofters are actually working on some of this stuff too as well, along with DIMS. So I think if they do see an update and it relates to some of the work that they're doing, they'll probably engage as well, and I can loop them in the process. So if you link to the issue here and give an update in your issue, I can talk with Claudio and Patrick and see where they're at with their Microsoft image process.
Okay. Yeah, speaking of the Windows ones, I did see there was a comment about trying to just bump all the versions because the Windows group was trying to make Windows versions of a bunch of packages. And so I think they're pretty far in the review, but one of the most recent ones was even for the things they're not making changes to except adding a Windows one. Like maybe it's just smart to bump all the versions so that it's more clear and simple how to revert if we need to.
Seems reasonable. Let's take a look at the parent issue, which is the breakdown. Do you have that? Does anyone have that handy? I think Andrew, you originally wrote it up.
Yeah, I can find it and then put it in the chat or something.
Let's do his issue. So this is the main one. This was the original one that he filed, and there should have been a follow-on. I'm looking for the one that breaks down the refactor for the framework to push it into. This is the follow-on from last time to add the import restrictions file, but I don't think we've done it yet. I'm not finding it.
Are you talking about like the utils refactor one?
Yes.
Okay, let me find that for you.
I think this is it actually here.
7, yeah.
All right, so I did see, George, a couple of your PRs go through, and I wanted to ask you a question with regards to, like, you took out like a signal signature out of some of the pieces of the utilities versus like checking over the entire utility. Was there a reason for that?
Just learning curve. I wanted to make sure I was doing the right thing and everything worked. But actually, yesterday I found a new PR that moves all the deployment utils to an actual subpackage within framework.
Okay, and that's this one here.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think there are a bunch of minor low-hanging fruit here. Like all of this stuff could use help. If people haven't actually submitted the PR, don't consider it. Just talk with the person listed here, and feel free to go at it. I know this is a good area for making progress too as well. Easy low-hanging fruit and just knock it out.
Yeah, I'll clear the description because I know, yeah, some of those folks haven't been active.
Yeah. So yeah, this is low-hanging fruit. Feel free to knock it out. I think that's probably still the main objective for us to just get this part done. That will make it import restrictions even smaller. Once we have the import restrictions file, then we can actually get things a little bit clearer. And then we could take the second pass evaluation of harder problems to solve. This problem is pretty super straightforward, really easy to understand. It's just dependency problems.
Yeah, it's also worth noting there are 2 separate issues on top of this one that track similar things, but we wanted to break it up into more easily more smaller tasks. So if you actually scroll down, there's the yeah. So scroll down a little more. Yeah, right there. So breakup and refactor test E2E framework utils.go.
Yeah, that one's
That one's just for utils.go because it's such a large file.
Yep.
So we broke that one up as well. And then there's a dedicated issue for moving all the logf functions into using logf functions in its dedicated package to prevent some of the import cycles. So that's also a separate issue.
Why don't we, just so we can see them easier. And I'll also do this because these are the main ones to follow up on. I think for this cycle, they're probably the easiest ones to accomplish. All right, so that'll make it easier to link through when we walk through it again next time. Everyone kind of knows the state. Does anyone have questions about the state? Or should we just kind of, we could probably end today early and just get back to work.
I just want to talk about the import restrictions file because that got assigned to me.
Sure.
So, I mean, an example was given. in that ticket. And that's for a KubeADM, and it says effectively like don't import the internal client and don't import provider-specific implementation details. So what are the things that we're trying to prevent the framework from importing? Do you want me to just copy those? Like we don't want to use the internal client or provider-specific things? Or it doesn't really matter what I put there. The point is, you know, a week, a month, 2 months from now, we want to edit it and we just want the file in place. What is the goal? What do we really want to restrict?
The internal client, because we already did the work to make that change. So that would be a good one to make sure that we prevent from happening again. The biggest thing that I want to prevent is the transitive dependencies from the provider-specific implementations into the framework. Mm-hmm. That's probably the biggest one, because especially, I believe Microsoft was the largest offender, where if you somehow got some Azure bits into there, it was just importing like all of the Azure client libraries, and it was insane. So I remember if we can reduce that graph, what you'll find over time too is that as we move those providers out of tree, the actual import issues with KK would go away too. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the KK, I don't even know what the file is anymore. It used to be the GoDep log file. I haven't looked at the new Go modules implementation in KK. So let's take a look here.
Go.mod. Should be something there.
So if I do Microsoft, it's surprisingly small.
Oh, it's because we moved the Azure provider to staging, so you have to check the go.mod file in staging.
That's filthy lies. That's almost like at least before, like your GoDep file would actually be some resemblance of truth.
Yeah, maybe someone can fill me in. Like, what is the time horizon on this like whole staging stuff? I know it's the like stopgap while you're trying to move things to other repos, but it's just been like that for as long as I can kind of remember. I haven't always worked in the Kubernetes repo, but
I think it's an abomination. I think it was originally intended to be a stopgap measure that has lived on in perpetuity, and some people actually like it because of Stockholm Syndrome. I do not understand why you would do this other than to get vanity URLs for imports. But if you actually created the directory structure for KK and made it venerable and had all the rules in KK proper, then I don't think it even matters, because it's very confusing to everyone who's not working on KK, and even people who are working on KK, to understand what are the import rules for like client Go, right? It is almost unintelligible for them to make sense out of it, right? And the only people that think this is a good idea are those who have actually created this thing, because I have not heard from anyone or any external consumer that has said, "Wow, this is super intuitive. Thanks, guys." I've only heard like angst and frustration.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's just a matter of like they got like 80% of the way or something to moving these things to their own repo. And now that it's working and it's stable, it's just like they're hesitant to actually cut the cord or something. I don't know.
Well, the biggest problem is imports, right? Like, because the APIs aren't fully fleshed out, there's this weird dependency graph problem where, like, if you promote one thing across the chain, it will ripple through all of the code, because instead of having like an abstractive model, where you sort of have a model view controller style thing, where you have a layer of indirection, like an SDK is a good example of this. If you had an SDK that abstracted the actual client library, which is the lowest level thing, and your client library had the actual churn, which it does, then you wouldn't be subject to all of the pits and follies of import problems. But because every time somebody changes the actual API, it ripples through all the code because it's a document view model. For those who aren't familiar with it, you can go back to like what was the name of the and the Microsoft Foundation classes, like back in the 90s. Like every time you touched one thing, it touched everything else, right? It's basically the model for how they've done things with the API. The API is so prolific that it touches everything else, and it ripples through everything else. There's no abstraction layer to teach you around the API.
To bring us back just real quick to the import restrictions file, one of the things Lubomir had requested or commented would be helpful is a visualization of the dependency graph. So I'm going to try and work on that. Again, the vanity URLs are posing a problem with at least the first 2 or 3 tools that I've tried. It just can't figure it out. And then some of the tools just haven't been updated to work with Go modules. So I don't know. I'll see if I can fix that and maybe bring a picture to show next week.
I had to work with the import restrictions file a lot when I was tackling at the dependencies for cloud providers. So feel free to ping me and I can help you with that. But generally, a good starting point is to just do like go list in the framework package and look at all the imports back to KK, and then just put only those set of imports as the allowed set, and everything else is not allowed except for external imports. And that's usually a good place. And then we can just start trimming off each import one at a time.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. So as long as we have the import restrictions file, that gives us a starting point too, to start to cleave off stuff. So I think once we have the concrete file in place, we can start to take a look at it and inspect, and then start to shuffle code around. But we got plenty of work to do, and because this is kind of like a side task for most folks, the progress is still kind of like incremental and slow, and that's fine. Are there any questions about the main objectives here still? I think those are still the P0 items of what we're trying to accomplish. If we could actually get like a chunk of this chunk done for 115, I think that would actually be super duper progress, because it's kind of lived in perpetuity in its current state for a long time.
Hey, team, I have a question here. Looks like most of the issue already be assigned, or at least people already take on. Is there particular issue I can look at it?
So there's been a lot of folks who have volunteered for the work, but then has not picked up any work. So I need to groom all the issues and remove names that haven't actually been active. So I'll do that right now after the meeting, and then you can take a look at the issues and assign yourself again.
So TLDR on these issues is if somebody ping the person, if they haven't actually worked on it, just take it. That's the common modus operandi across the project, is that just because a person's assigned doesn't mean that they're actually actively working on it. Go ahead and take it. And we'll just mark or update the actual issue itself. And there's a lot of actually work items that are there. Like you can see, this is just the utils package. And this is the broader, no, that's just the util package. And this is all the other separate utilities. I do know that George was working on this one, but a lot of these other ones, you can just have at it.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah.
So one other question I had was, do we need a KEP for this work? So I know maybe for like right now, like just breaking up utils and stuff, maybe not, but I feel like whenever we get to the point where we can actually stage the framework, do we need a KEP to point to and say, this is why we're doing this?
Code refactor work is typically not KEP worthy. KEP worthy is meant to, I think maybe near the end, or maybe when we're actually getting to the point where we want to be able to vendor it, we can write up a KEP, but it's only for meant to be as a consumption, is that we are creating this framework to be vendorable, right? That's the primary goal and objective, but because it's not like a high level feature, especially not in its current form. Right now, it's just a ton of refactoring that it doesn't really rise to that level. It's not end user consumable. It doesn't cut across the project, so it doesn't meet the criteria.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, I don't think we need it for the refactoring, but yeah, for the staging, and then when we have to request a new repo, it might be useful to have a proposal.
Then I do think that is kept worthy, and we should, because that applies to other folks across the project. So I do think we should raise that issue. I don't think we're ready for that, and in fact, I don't think we'll hit it for 115, given that we're part-timing most of this work.
Yeah, sounds good.
Are there any other questions about the core issues right now? Otherwise, we can just take a look at some of the PRs. Going once, twice, 3 times. All right, I'm gonna start closing some windows here. So this is interesting. Staging GCE cloud provider.
Yeah, so that's part of the extraction efforts. The only reason this was labeled is because we touch the providers directly in the framework, but it's not really related to the work here. Same with the AWS one.
This is the one that I already commented on, isn't it?
That's a new one that moves everything from deployment utils into an actual sub-package or framework.
Okay. So here's a question for everybody while we have everybody on the horn. How do we want to name these things for imports, right? Because that's been like the common thing that we've seen over and over again. I'm not a big fan of like long-winded names.
Yeah, the framework prefix does make it a little verbose. So, I mean, what we had seen with the log was we were going forward saying ETE log to make sure it didn't clash with the standard library log. I
like ETE a little bit better than framework. It's more descriptive of what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like even for this one, like EDE deploy would be, I think, sufficient.
I like that.
1 second.
Let's take a look here. And then we could follow that pattern with the other ones too, because it'd be E2E whatever as the pattern that we use for imports. This standard just changing the imports. I don't think he changed anything else, just the code shuffle. He didn't change the actual code, right? I'd have to take a look and do a diff across those. I'm asking George.
Yeah, it was just a code shuffle mostly.
Yeah.
The other only bit of organization is I took the deployment utils and separated into actual helper functions, which are within the utils.go file, and wrappers, which just call a bunch of functions from the test E2E utils, or from test utils.
Okay, then I have to look at this a little bit more depth. But I think that should be sufficient to, this will take you a little bit. So maybe we should comment on that.
Now, is that going to be a requirement in all cases? Just like, because sometimes there's just not a conflict, right? Log was like a really common use case. Obviously, you have to kind of change that name. I have one open right now that's SSH, which there is a standard library SSH, but it's just not commonly used. So it conflicted in like one file.
I think if it's very germane to the end-to-end testing framework, we should prefix it because it makes a lot more sense when you're reading the code. Nothing is more unintuitive than when you have like name over the import sort of naming problems or like collisions around what behavior belongs to what thing, especially when you go from file A to file B. It just makes your brain segfault, right? Like if you're reviewing a ton of these, having similar patterns just makes it easier, right? Right, so that's one done. Is there any other interesting ones that came in? This is the SSH one you're talking about?
Yeah, that's mine. And so that one, it's pretty straightforward. There was one or two changes because the fact there was one function that used the test context. So I had to change its signature. All it really needed was the provider name.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just had that function take another parameter. But now it's sort of funny because the function is node exec, which is almost identical to the SSH function, except the order of the parameters is slightly different, and you don't have to join it to the SSH port. So you just tell it the node name instead of join host port name and port 22. So like they're almost identical. Eventually you want to change them out or just delete one, but for the purposes of a refactor PR, I didn't want to do that. GoLint complained about some stuttering, so I had to change one type. There was something called SSH result. So that's fixed now too.
Yeah, I think it'd just be easier because when you're referencing, if it's a framework library and just looking at the code, it's actually not intuitive if you didn't double check your imports, for every single file. I think having that pattern will make it a lot easier to actually read the framework code.
Okay. Yeah, there were some constants I had to pull in, some helper methods at the bottom, but they were all pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I'll just leave this going for the time being. And again, if you want me to actually look at things, unless I'm assigned, I will never see it.
You used the wrong handle there.
Oops. That doesn't even seem to me.
So while John mentioned test context, can we actually talk about if we feel the need to move text context variable into a separate package? Because what I'm finding is that we dump a lot of important information in text context. So like a lot of times a package would just import framework just because it needs to access text context. So if we moved it, would that be beneficial or too complicated?
I tried to do that. And it was pretty much impossible in the current state. So in my opinion, like that seems like a good goal, but I think that we've got to finish a lot of the other stuff first, and then maybe even consider not just moving test context to another place, but actually breaking apart the God object that is test context. So there are some really specific pieces like that are just provider specific, but they're in test context.
Here's what I want to do with test context in the fullness of time. I've given this some thought. I've thought about it. I looked at it. It is just a ginormous thunk of goo where the dependencies are ripped through the code all over the place. So we spent a lot of time, like literally on the order of months, getting our component config for kubeadm to be where it's at. And it has warts, it's not perfect, but it's a composable configuration where only dependencies for certain things are isolated to their domain based upon the code. This took a long time to get there, order of months to get this in this state where it's at. But in the ideal world, this is where I want test context to go, is to be a well-defined component config that is serializable, versionable, importable, almost like an API. That way, if a person wants to reuse a subsection of the test context, they can still do that. The input file, which you'll see typically here, is they have the separator. So there is separate components that they could use as part of this, and that means that they could take the pieces that they need. So it is a well-structured, well-versioned file format for importing for kubeadm in this case, right? But again, order of months. So this is where I want to get to. I do not think we're going to be able to accomplish this in any meaningful time frame in 1.15, but I do think it's worthy to talk about. Like, we could restructure the objects themselves, and that alone would get us a good way there without us having to do all the API machinery, right? If you just made the objects be a composable structure, but you'd have to tease it apart, then you'd have to update all the call sites. I think what you should probably do for something like this, this would be like at least internal proposal level thing, right? Where we'd have to write it down, talk about the implications of what it means, and then figure out if this is what we're going to do, because it would ripple through all of the tests, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. My main concern is that, yeah, like if we leave this for later, it'll end up blocking a lot of the other work because of the import cycles back to framework. But yeah, okay, yeah. Seems like
you're saying like how when I was doing the SSH, I said I had to change a method signature just because of one field on the text context. That's the sort of stuff you're saying, except 10 times worse for certain packages.
Yeah, and it'll actually be like a full blocker, because if we're importing a package that imports framework back, there's a good chance that somewhere there's an import cycle that'll block work. So like, would it make sense to just do a lift and shift into a separate package? Like, I don't know how easy that is. It doesn't sound easy, but is that work worthwhile just to unblock some of the other work, or do we want to just go with it and see, like maybe the import cycle thing is not an issue with text context and just go forward with that?
With this specific example that John mentioned earlier, I think decoupling these utilities from the need of the actual framework itself or the parameters, I think that's a useful thing to do. It's a worthwhile effort, because these utilities should not import back in. They're not a generic utility then, right? I think that decoupling work alone is worthwhile, and that'll also give us context for how we want to shape this thing. The problem with changing the test context is it ripples through everything, right? So you'd have to figure out a way to decouple the pieces of the test context. So I think this work is still beneficial and useful to do. And then you actually have an importable SSH framework thing that's external if you need to use that. Good, bad, and different thoughts?
Wait, sorry. So you're saying that we should look at the specific parts of framework that get imported in the, take specific parts of text context that get imported throughout the various like util packages and try to tease those out instead of trying to move text context itself? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, continue down this road for this cycle, teasing apart the dependencies and making sure that they don't import cycle through back into framework, because that makes it a generic utility. Otherwise, it's not really a generic utility, it's just a lump of goo, right? And as we do that, we can make comments and maybe in the test context about where the parameters and structure organizational work should be. I think it's going to take a while to get us to the point where we have a well-factored non-import cycle-based configuration.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. It might also be worthwhile just to look into like what we can do with interfaces here to get rid of some of those, but
yeah. I think tinkering with it is a worthwhile effort, but I also think it could be a black hole, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
These are whips. Golint. Just for what it's worth, for us, at least, that because some of these people that are doing this asynchronously, like these are the Japanese folks that are trying to help out. it's not a bad idea to help with GoLint. It's not a prerogative though, because GoLint has a bunch of false positives, and we have a bunch of other utilities already in place for checking. I've never been a true fan of GoLint. Like some things are useful, like in particular the commenting for public functions. I think that's a useful thing. So people actually depend upon pieces, especially as framework gets teased apart. That's a useful thing. But the like this import one, the dot imports, it's not a useful thing. I don't see this as being like there's no tangible benefit to this particular change.
So there's an umbrella issue for GoLint work, but I think what's happening is that because we have the auto label set up on the owner's file, any GoLint changes that touch the framework is just being labeled. So should we just go ahead and like unlabel the GoLint ones so that it's not on our radar? Because I don't think anyone is like opening these PRs with testing commons, like with that context of testing commons. They're just doing like generic GoLint fixes across the code base, and it happens to be labeled.
It doesn't bother me because I've been putting it in a bucket, and if other people get to it first, then I deal with it. But just on our group, GoLint is not a priority. There are very few tangible benefits that I see for adding GoLint behavior. I don't or making it pass all the GoLint checks. Sometimes it does, surface things that are worthwhile to fix, but we have a bunch of other checks that are in place that are probably of higher value.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I'll just mention that one so you have remembered the hat Go imports or update Go imports. That's just kind of a work in progress. I'll cycle back to it at some point, probably break it up. The point was I added a little helper script to just run Go imports everywhere, but I think I was hitting some odd bugs because it still fails. It like ended up duplicating some imports. But this was just really useful because when I was first trying to update for like moving the logging package, right, it affected hundreds of files, which I didn't want to update manually. So then I ran this on everything and it just like blew up the world a little bit. So I'll cycle back. It seems like a useful tool to have in there. But yeah.
I saw this before. The one, we have to make sure we get Google's buy-in on this particular one.
We have to make sure Google has buy-in on it. Is that what you said?
Yes.
I mean, also just to clarify the expectation, I guess I was putting in there sort of I was going to use it myself, was also sharing it because I thought other people might want to use it, but I wasn't expecting it to be like run as a check or like always has to pass this or anything like that. So I guess I'm a little confused why it would need particular buy-in from a bunch of Googlers.
Because it would affect all their other stuff. We just want to make sure they sign off. The problem with that particular area of the code is that, sorry, wrong one. It has to do with order files.
Has to do with what?
Order files.
Okay.
Which one is it?
Right there in the middle. You just passed it. Up a little bit.
Am I missing?
Yeah, a little. You have to scroll up a bit and then to the top. A
Reflector.
little bit more. Yeah, right at the top there.
At the top. Move free.
Are you looking for
the hack imports? Sorry, too many. Yeah, it's because of owner files references, right? You're touching literally everything. And because you're touching literally everything, here's the problem with Kubernetes. You are touching code that exists across the entire code base. And because of that, I only have certain rights because I willfully cut myself out of pieces of the code because I didn't want to be a reviewer for that code. So now, because you touch all of this, you need a root level approver to get this through.
I see. Yeah, I might, like I said, just break this up because somebody else was complaining about that V1 import that keeps being put into everyone's PRs separately.
Yes.
They kind of wanted to do just to find and replace on that, which one possible fix too. I might just rerun this script locally and try and put up a smaller PR for just the framework, since that's the work we're focused on right now, and see the results.
Yeah. So yeah, the problem here is that if you were to add this update go imports, you could do it for the specific areas that we have approval rights in, but doing it generically across the entire code base and having it in the hack directory, that's going to need a root approver, which just means that it's going to be much more difficult to do.
If I break it up and just do like the framework, do you recommend I not even
don't
go import script entirely, just the result of running it?
Just the result of running it, because we can do that within the framework and that'll be fine. And then your local environment, if you have that set up in your IDE, then you'll have less squiggly lines or annoyances in your IDE.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. I don't know if there's anything else that's worthwhile talking about. I'm going to probably punt on this particular one. I'm not a big fan of how we do command line interfaces for the end-to-end testing framework, and I really want to use component config and get that in place. I know for long-term benefit of things that affect both cluster lifecycle and testing commons, component config is a strategic effort that I think has high impact value, but it's a hard piece of work. And I think that is a good piece of effort, and that would affect the test context, right? So having a systematic, unified way of being able to create a configuration file and make sure that you have plumbing through for command line overrides for some things, that's super useful. But there's like 2 key contributors working on it, and one of those key contributors is like part-time in it. So it's progress is super slow. So we should start to resource that effort, like if possible, because that will help us in the testing area, and it also help in cluster lifecycle. I don't have anything else, I think. These other ones are those generic ones that cut across the whole project. Are there any other questions that other folks have? Okay. In that case, we'll cut it a little early and have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.